Talk a lot. Now tonight's Tales from the Tunnel. One man had two places of residency and had concluded that he spent an inordinate, unprofitable amount of time in one of them at the expense of the other. He held this belief for a number of years, only to ultimately suspect that he may have had it backwards. The live and let live adage is to no advantage if you neither live nor live to learn. A true mythical warrior confronts a foe who, after being originally sighted, begins a process of expansion which, if he's pursued long enough, culminates in him reaching a state of supreme shrinkage. What manner of opponent is it that can expand and contract to accommodate all possible configurations of itself, other than life itself? When he heard it said that there is a whole big old world out there that you've never seen, one man mused, yeah, and I never will if I keep thinking about it. The ordinary hear the sound of a gunshot, not as a gunshot, but as nihilism. And the sound of a coin as good fortune, not as the sound of a coin. Is it any wonder that the third order of reality normally goes unheard? You can always be more there than you are. Were this not so, all activities such as this would be an extreme example of futility of effort. To compensate for not going anywhere, one man thought about it a lot. And what was that guy's name? You don't really want to know. Speculative forecasters may get an article published, but they never comprehend the future. On one world, the creatures were inflamed to think passionately and vigorously for 10 years, and then to lay off for the next 50, and then try and pick it back up again. Then on another world was a similar situation, yet different. There was once two sister planets, and on the first they produced all stories and myths, while the second provided all the morals and conclusions thereto. There were, on these two worlds, small numbers of inhabitants who prayed for a meteorite to come and destroy their home and thus set them free. Among the mystics, a life devoted to the helping of others was originally for the purpose of driving one from a too much living in one's mind. For the few, charity begins at home only when one leaves home. As he cleaned the night's stable to himself, so said his squire, "'Tis hell to be weak and know not why." While outside, as he mounted his steed, so reflected the Templar himself. "'Tis hell to be weak and know why. Yet most worthy I find the cleaving to my order, without which my condition I would have never known." A mythical warrior without goodwill will not soon enough get himself killed. One man's enjoiner to himself was, "You think too much," but was unclear as to whether he referred to the actual quantity of what he thought or to the fact that he thought it all. And on top of that was uncertain as to the functional significance of either one, should they be true. The serpentine alternative. You can clasp a viper to your forehead or impose it on the landscape. The question of the mystical ages How can you ever get off a train if you never know that you're on one? How can you ever get better if you never know that you're well now? And how can you ever grow and expand if you never have a correct knowledge of your present size and condition? Self-diagnosis is of no value if you've diagnosed the wrong self. Watching sports is to exercise as listening to others is to thinking. The original King Arthur had 3 armies of knights. The first would ride off and act. The second seemed in charge of planning the acts, while about the third, nothing is publicly known. While on a carousel, you can make no decisions. Or you can decide to get off or to stay on, even decide to postpone any such decision. But these are not real decisions in that they presage no upcoming actions possible on a whirligig. As he prepared to board the ride of his mind, he requested, "1 ticket, please," only to receive the reply, "That won't be necessary." Now another in our series of You Have to Know the Secret, this time in the form of a poem. You can look up close or you can look far away, but you can't do both unless you try real hard. An exposition of the dictum, you live, then you die. Anything else is just you thinking about it. To wit, you eat, then you get full. You think about it, and that's called dining. Number 2, you screw, then you're through. You think about it, and that's called romance. Another, you're sick, then you get well. You think about it, and that's called getting somewhere in life. But don't forget the mother pair of them. You live, then you die. All the rest is just you thinking about it. CSDTSB IAPDFTF could sound depressing to some, but is a revelatory delight for the few. Of potential alertness, the number is up to 3, of the body, of the mind, and that which can oversee the 2. The never-ending dance of talking, listening, listening, talking, talking, listening, listening, talking, and so on, is a primary social adhesive in the mental state of man. The missing part of all mythical tales is that which tells how the knights initially ride off in all possible directions, in search of innumerable treasures, prepared to combat countless foes, only to ultimately find their adventure narrowed considerably. I say considerably in the strongest possible terms of understatement. A mystic with much on his mind is not much of a mystic. Even at the routine level, there are 2 kinds of thinking. Are there 2 kinds of thinking? Thinking and not thinking. As when one man condemns another's ineffectual mental exertion with the words, "Well, you're not thinking." When the condemned is undoubtedly engaged in some sort of neural activity. So, what is that second type of non-thinking thinking all about? And now this. Thinking can be fun, but so can unadorned consciousness. Thinking can be fun, but so can non-thinking when it is willful. The abrupt, the brutal, the plain and obvious are all the same to the keen of eye. P.S. They're also torment and inspiration to that same few. More medieval definitions brought up to date for forward-looking knights. Thought. unnecessary codpieces for the mind. Throughout his life, did his elders advise, be sure and wear some protection when you go out. And only later on did he learn what it meant to go out of himself in such a way that no protection was possible or wanted. The true mental warrior is he with nothing left to defend. One day, amidst his routine, non-stop marathon thinking, a man said to himself, give it a rest. And immediately wondered, how? There are two things from which a mystic knight can never run, and they're both within him. One is the thing itself, the other, the constant awareness of the thing. There is yet a third thing having to do with abandonment, but we'll save that for another day. To an alert man, his best ideas are always yet to be thought, and his best ones of the past of limited value. In one unpublished version of the legend, the greatest knight of them all was Sir Shut Up. While in an even more unpublished one, the grandest of the gallant ones was the warrior known as He Who No Longer Thinks About It Much. There was once a chivalrous order whose heraldry contained the pronouncement, no matter how high up you go, the good knight is always within sight of his own asshole, appearing, of course, on life's behalf and in its stead. A man with nothing left to hide can afford to live alone. Live, that is. The collective die as a group, while the few persist in their journey as though sole survivors be. One man wore glasses till he ruined his eyes, while his brother thought thoughts till he rendered his mind irredeemable. The continuing supreme theological inquiry. Where will you be when the Messiah returns and he turns out to be you? A warrior who lives too much in his head may the chance miss to find himself dead. Take heed, brave knight, such fate falls not on you. What watchword for the mystic, the warrior, the pursuer of all things wondrous, can there be greater than alertness? An alertness not confined to a single sector of thy kingdom. Vigilance, brave knights, a total awareness above all. Well, it all seems plain enough for me. Of course, I read them, so maybe I'm at a slight advantage to you listening. One man had two places of residency. Just for the sake of, since I've already drawn it, I'm not sure what I was going to do, but that's like I suspect that there are other possible variations and uses of that rather than the one that I'd most recently selected as being, the upper part being man's mental existence, and that below being his instinctive, or that below being the life that man automatically and instinctively lives, and the one above being where he believes otherwise. But there could be others, for all I know. I just draw them. And there might be some connection to this first story. One man had 2 places of residency and had concluded that he spent an inordinate, unprofitable amount of time in one of them at the expense of the other. He held this belief for a number of years, only to ultimately suspect that he may have had it backwards. Well, rather than beat around the diagram, how about this? All accounts of all men who have ever been involved with the so-called mythical, even mystical struggle, search, adventure, use as an absolute minimum some form of study. And it will generally get around, according to their belief, their translation, that it will in some way eventually turn out to be a study of themselves. There are some people who undertake the kind of weekend avocational mythical journey who never even get to that point, however, because you normally start out there, that there has to, not normally, you always start out with there being the appearance of some external model, some way by which to gauge progress, some way by which to ascertain your position to begin with. That the Bible would say, well, here you start from, or most religions, from a flawed position, and what you're trying to do is reach a less flawed, a more perfected position. The Arthurian knight legends, torted and twisted to suit my nefarious needs, would be like the Fisher King or King Arthur sending out the knights saying, we have problems right here in River Castle, right here in the castle. And he sent them out sans trombones, but he sent them out that go from the castle and go find the grail, or go find the cure for this ill that has befallen our dear liege. So there has to be a place to start. And at of supreme importance, of the greater importance to start with, always appears to the supplicant, the would-be knight, the would-be adventurer, it always seems to be the external materials that the religion or the so-called mystical system provides, some sort of scripture, literature, directions from some past leader, something to be studied. Many people never get past that point, but I was giving some additional credit that it is not unknown, even amongst the fairly routine would-be mystics, for them to come to the conclusion, at least historically, after the fact, that the study, the proper study of so-called Holy Writ, or the so-called external, they could even be symbols, that the proper study, the proper use of them is not to learn about, for instance, a Muslim, the Quran, is to learn about yourself. Or the proper study of a real Buddhist would not be the study of the many symbols. The mantras would be, but it would be that ultimately the study becomes a study of oneself. But no matter to what degree those people reach, in my just past telling of it, they still operate on the basis that something must be studied. That would seem obvious enough. If you're going to gain anything in life, if it's something beyond the physical realm, if you're not, it's beyond the area of simply trying to gain muscle, which is easy to do, somebody can give you directions, but anything beyond that, the directions seem to be of supreme necessity. That you're trying to go from one position internally, spiritually, mentally, consciously. You're trying to go from one position to another, and the directions seem of supreme importance because no one knows where to start. So study would seem to be beyond any grasp of criticism. We cannot attack in any reasonable way the whole idea of study. But here's a man who had found himself living he had two places of residency. And he had come to the conclusion, I'll flesh it out a little bit, after studying the situation, he came to the conclusion that he lived in one of these two places of residency. He lived in one, an inordinate, it isn't an unseemly, a useless amount of time. And by doing so, having two places of residency, if that be true, then of course it's at the expense of the other one. And he held this belief, he held this conviction for a number of years, only to ultimately suspect that he may have had it backwards. How in the sweet name of Confucius could a man, if we give him now credit that my story has metaphorical potential, and we're not simply talking about a man who had a in-town house and then a home at the lake. We're talking about something else. Then if a man had any potential, any nascent mystical qualities, and he had studied such a matter for a number of years and come to a conclusion which he held as he continued to study, that he was been living, that he had taken up an inordinate, useless, unprofitable, wasteful amount of time in one of the residencies at the expense of the other, giving the man some credit. How could, when I say for some years, I won't go ahead and tell you, I mean a long number of years, that he held this conviction, and that fit in what he continued to observe, what he continued to study, it all fit. But to ultimately came he to the place of suspecting that he may have had the damn thing ass backwards. If by any fortuitous happenstance anyone is following any of this so far, I still recommend to you the rhetorical question, how could this be? Perhaps I didn't make the complex, confusing part, which should have been the setup, simple enough so that the punchline, which seems simple enough, would be surprisingly confusing and complex. Or, of course, I could have it backwards. Glad to have cleared that up. My intention was, and maybe it succeeded with some of you at a nonverbal level, was to produce something resembling fright, or at least severe apprehension, which is good for you. It's a bastard stepson of vigilance. It was the attempt to nudge you in the direction that a person could be involved with what appeared to be quite seemingly, quite appropriate activity, even of an extraordinary nature, in such a way that his continuing observations, what he continually perceived to be new discoveries, all fit this extraordinary model that he had adopted. That all of what seemed to be his new discoveries, all the new vistas he seemed to view, all the new areas that he seemed to explore, and his interpretations thereof, all fit in with his observation. Not to find out that we're wrong now. There's a difference between being incorrect and wrong than it is to be asked backwards. Being wrong is far too close to being mortal. Being asked backwards approaches divinity. Think about it. In a non-thinking manner, but you can think about it later. Well, if whether I did bring you up abrupt with it or not, I was going to point out that this has been played out in man's myths and legends and never analyzed in this manner. That all of the well-known religious figures, being the easiest and most widely recognized, that all of them played out in their stories, the myths and the tales told about their birth and their rise to adulthood and then apparently their ascension to some state of higher consciousness, if you go back and consider them, all of them, Jesus, Buddha being two of the great ones, but they all got a piece of it, that they seem to apply themselves, or they did apply themselves, according to the story, to a certain line of pursuit, a line of activity of a non-standard nature. That is, they were seeking the Holy Grail. They were seeking a state of enlightenment, a liberation of consciousness, a liberation, a freeing of the mind in some new way. And that they all spent a number of years. And the way the tales are normally told, they really bring it up abruptly and bring it up short. That they seem to have went da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And it's like the end of a paragraph, and then you go down to the next paragraph, and their tales are not told this way. And I don't mean anyone was hiding anything, because they weren't. But if you can see it in a certain way, then it skips down to the next paragraph, and it's almost as though you'd been watching, say, a soap opera or some continuing series of a television show, and it went along, it went fine. The next day you turned it on, and it all seemed the same figures are there, the same storyline is more or less there, but it's as though, even though you know it wasn't true, you know that you saw it yesterday, and you turned it on today, but you sit there for a minute and you listen to what's going on, the characters talking, the storyline is more or less where it's recognizable, but it's as though some number of days, some of the chapters have suddenly disappeared. They were dropped out, and it went from da-da-da-da-da. You tune in tomorrow, the next paragraph, and it went da-da-da-da-da-da. And it almost seems like it's all right, except there has been an abrupt shift and no account thereto given. For some reason I picked these others out. Among the mystics, a life devoted to the helping of others, a work of charitable acts, devoting oneself to that kind of life, was originally for the purpose of driving one from a too much living in one's mind. At least any of you have picked up the notion or thought that you ever heard from this platform a discounting of charity, especially living a life devoted to helping others, which of course I've tried to do in the past for a certain purpose. But as always, anything that has that kind of longevity, anything that is that part of the mainstream of life, even into the less than mainstream areas such as the religious and the mystical, it is an historically accepted way of life, given credence as having potentially wondrous payoffs. That is, devoting oneself, from all appearances, strictly to the betterment, to the welfare of other people. A true charitable saint. As little, read nothing, as little as that affords an ordinary charitable would-be saint. It is a reflection of something that initially had a quite direct and real purpose. Am I beating around the words again too much? From one quite valid view, from a non-binary, from a non-instinctive automatic view of life, to say that doing good works, living your life for the benefit of others, any belief that that will in some way make you more conscious, ordinary people, is folly. It's not true. Any more than devoting your life to the pursuit of some religious ritual or rituals. It is simply not true. You cannot become more conscious than an ordinary person. You will not become more godlike. You will not become more understanding of what human existence is about through charitable works, even devoting your life freely to helping others. But behind it was originally a purpose for the few. It all, as always, still has to do with a matter of attention, with vigilance, with better, if not more fashionable versions of the hair shirt. Assuming the first part is correct, I told you that trying to help others has nothing to do with being more conscious. And again, I'll take the time for a second to point out, as we oftentimes have done, this in no wise has any currency, has any validity amongst ordinary people. Because for an ordinary person to hear such as that and say, do you mean that there's something wrong with being charitable? And of course, no, there is nothing wrong. And you would certainly be amiss, if not extremely dense, to ever get in any sort of argument, any sort of discussion with an ordinary person as far as the value, the propriety of being charitable. It's neither here nor there. But now back to us talking. The mere fact of devoting one's life to trying to help others, if you had any semblance, any spark of being potentially more conscious, you have to very quickly see it's not true on the basis that people do not need help. Again, you can't say that to an ordinary person, because they can say, well, here's a child starving. Well, feed him, help him. But insofar as charitable works are called for, that humanity needs help, it does not need help. And you can either see it or not see it, but you cannot be convinced of it, and it makes no sense. And if you want to discuss it, then I'm wrong. Anytime you want to discuss anything that is not binary based, it's always wrong. I mean, that's a given. If you don't understand that, is why I hesitate to always back up and give these little asides and caveats to you, not to the public. But take it as a given what I said, that doing a life of good work will no more make you conscious than it would being a full-time priest or a rabbi, devoting yourself to any religion. Helping others is not going to change your level of consciousness. But consider what I'm pointing out, that the initial purpose of it, whoever conceived of it, was if you need something to distract you, to direct your attention away from that from which it should be directed. Dare I say it, it was in the stories tonight, of perchance living too much in your own head. What would be better? You could go ahead and put jumping jacks in your shoes. You could go ahead and wear an army blanket, cut it up and turn it into jockey shorts. You could go around and continually slash yourself slightly with a razor until you ran out of skin, usable skin. But what better than to try and turn all of your activities outwardly? Now, anyone who did this, whoever first came up with it, you do understand that it was also a fact already accomplished that whoever did it, whoever the first person, Adam's first grandson, let's say, that he already had the understanding that nothing is wrong with life. There is nothing to be helped. There is no really such thing as charity, because humanity, life itself, is in need of no charitable acts. It needs no help. So he understood that. But then he understood, if he understood that much, he understood that he needs help. Because any true warrior needs help. It can only come from one place, but still, he needs help. And we could, to put it quite simply, say that he needs a reminder of several things, all the same thing, but several things of what his intention is, what his aim is, what he knows thus far that it will take to keep him on track, some semblance of being on track. He knows all of that. And it's all, for a long period of time, a matter of attention, a matter of memory. In the same sense, I pointed out that for ordinary people to say that they cannot be charitable, that it is not possible to be a true Christian, it's not possible to be truly Christ-like or Buddha-like, is not true. Anybody can do it. All they've got to do is remember it. All they got to do is say, well, I want to do so-and-so. I want to love my fellow man as myself. Okay? If you can remember to do it, you can do it. But if you don't remember to do it, you can't do it. And nobody can remember to do it, and therefore, with all full faith, they can say, I can't do it. And they can look around and say, no one can do it. No one I know. No one who says that they are attempting to be a Christian or a Jew or a Buddhist can do it. But it's simply not true. If you ask them what would it take, and it basically boils down to treat others as yourself, which would be a true act of charity. Anybody can do it. Turn away a harsh word. You say, can you do that? Can somebody come and call you an ignorant, ugly-looking son of a bitch, and you not respond to it? Can you do that? And a person says, well, yeah. I mean, if you're going to put it as a theoretical, isolated example, can I do that? Yes. In fact, have you done that? Well, yes. I can think of times I've done that, and I can see that I could do it right now. Now that you present it in that kind of theory. Then the question should be, well, how the hell, where do you go off telling me that you can't do it, that you can't be a Christian? And no matter how they try to do it, I think we've explored this sufficiently, and perhaps not. No matter how they explain it, they can try and weave these tapestries of evil forces and Satan in the machine and Lucifer under their bed sheets. It all comes down to one thing. You ask the person. So you say that you have done it, you have been able to turn the other cheek, you have been able at times to treat those who seem to dislike you, to treat them as a friend, to at least not respond, to not carry on this continuing dialogue, even metaphorically, of aggression, of non-Christian behavior, of non-Muslim behavior. And the person says, well, yes. So you've done it. I'm not questioning, but you have done that. There's been an instance where you've actually been able to do that. When somebody, in essence, spat on you, and you did not actually respond. They go, well, yeah, I have done that. So it is possible. It is humanly possible to do it once. And he goes, yes. And you go, well, how the hell do you tell me that you can't be a Jew or a Christian? And no matter how they do it, it comes down to this. You'd be hard-pressed to ever get this out of a person, these words. But what it amounts to, as you should know, is, well, I don't know, it's like I don't concentrate. I get distracted, and somebody comes up, and I'm not expecting it, and they go, hey, you. And, first thing I know, it's like that. I mean, I can't help it. It can't be done. And they're wrong. You could be a Christian anytime you wanted to. You could be a Buddhist. You could be Buddha-like. You could be Moses-like. All you got to do is remember to do it. Because people know that it can be done. They just go, well, I don't know. It's like you can do it once. You can do it periodically. But it's like the forces are against you. You just don't remember to do so. So the man who came up with the original idea of charity, he understood if there's one thing that it takes is alertness, vigilance. And I am, of course, quite aware that everybody from mainstream fundamentalist religion to all sorts of would-be mystical systems to martial arts to certain philosophers, but especially the first several groups I just named, have used the idea of vigilance. They do not use it in a way that is practical. They do not use it in a way that is functional, but you can, in all religions, well, let's use the Bible, Christianity. Somewhere in the Bible, it's quoted all the time, there are more than one, but there's one about that you must be eternally vigilant. Lest the Spirit of God, lest Christ return, lest the Messiah come back, lest God speak to you, lest the truth be revealed to you, and you not be attentive. A more secular story, the one I've told you about the guy that finds a mystical school, and they agree, well, yes, you found us. And they said, isn't Master so-and-so here, the guy who knows everything? And they go, well, yeah. And they got this little peephole in the door. And they say, he only comes to the door. The only way you can get in is he has to come to the door himself and look out and see you and let you in. And we don't know when it'll be. You can stand there and wait. And you stand there and wait. It's a good old story. Christians finally, or somebody finally stole it and turned into St. Peter and the golden pearly gates. Anyway, you know the story. The guy stands there and dozes off. A truck goes by, a motorcycle, a good-looking girl in shorts. He looks away. I hate to blame it on sex. or Harley Davidson. But you know the story. The point is, he snoozed and he loosed. He looked off and suddenly he heard, he'd been standing there 10 years, 20 years, and the door opened. The big kahuna came out and looked, and he could have turned around and gotten in probably, and he looked off for a second. You know, something got in his eye, he picked his nose, he did something, and it's gone. So the idea of vigilance and alertness is everywhere, and they've even tried to turn to martial arts. They've even, people I know, have tried to take the idea of the knights and the warriors and on a level that the thing to be, or the thing required, speaking in a metaphorical, parabolic sense. To be a real warrior, the main thing is not a sword, not a steed, not a shield, but is your own alertness. Because a warrior is not going to survive. He's not going to survive to even begin the journey. If he's going to wander through the forest, if he's going to wander through the exotic lands, if he's going to wander around the castle itself, his home territory, partially dazed, going around to look, you know, kind of like a billy goat in his eyes. A warrior is not going to survive. You must constantly be alert. It's just obvious. And then, as I said, it is not that unknown even amongst the ordinary. To turn that into some passing metaphorical, or to give it some passing metaphorical significance, like, yes, that is important. And as I said, as most of you should know, religions carry it even further. When it really gets crude is the religions, the messianic religions, that even say that their leader, their God, their great force is actually going to come and call in all the faithful followers, and that you must constantly, physically, look for the son of a gun. You know, he might show up. He might be running a deli down the street from you, or he might be driving a cab you get in, and he just strikes up a conversation. That's getting real fundamental. That is the kind of real fairy tales for grown-up chillins. But somewhere between that and what I'd already mentioned is them trying to make religious fodder and hay out of the idea of vigilance. The point is, the currency, the reality behind the currency, the face on the currency is known with ordinary people. The reality is still not seen as being of any individual pertinence. It is certainly not seen as being functional, in that men will still excuse themselves, deny that they could be a Christian, when all that's required is the very words that they use about be vigilant, because they admit in isolated theoretical circumstance that they can be a Christian, they can live by the main tenet of the religion, or anything. It doesn't have to be a religion to understand. People would say, well, it's impossible to be a good fascist. You say, well, why? You know, what's the main, I'm just going to make them up as I go along. Surprise, surprise. I can't be a good fascist. And you say, well, what does it take to be a good fascist? And they say, well, you've got to hate everybody. And you go, well, okay. You mean you can't do it? And the guy said, well, no. I mean, like, just now I slipped up. When you walked up talking to me, I smiled and shook your hand. And you go, wait a minute. Hadn't there been times that you just kind of looked around at life and you just kind of had the red ass about everybody? You hate everybody? And you go, well, yeah, I have had that. And you go, well, so don't tell me it's not possible. You could do it. And he goes, well, yeah, but, you know, you slip. A child comes by or an old woman and you smile and, you know, first thing you know, you're being non-fascist. You understand? It's the same thing. I didn't want you to think it was all in some way attributable, connected only with religion. Vigilance is given great word of mouth with absolutely no attempt, no desire with ordinary people to look any further. But it is given even spiritual credence, as I said, of the quotes, and it's in all religious vademecums of all peoples, all their holy writ somewhere, many times over, repeats the idea that that a good Hindu, a good whatever, must be eternally vigilant. Least, and then it's always some threat. You know, least God show up when you're not ready, least the door open when you're distracted, least the secret be revealed to you and you were watching TV and didn't hear it. It's always be ever alert and vigilant, least. Ellipsis, fill it in yourself. Once you understand it, there is no threat. The lack of being vigilant and alert is the reality of the threat itself. By reality of the threat, you understand, it's no longer a threat. It is the threat made live. You don't need anything else. And where I started all this was about charity, to point out something that is now part of mainstream life, that any civilized person will give a quite positive, a passionate, give their support verbally, theoretically, to charity. And would certainly give their support to someone who devoted themselves to good works, to helping others. It is now it is part of the woof and weave of civilization. Then, I point out to you, as you should already begin to see yourself, insofar as that having any effect on the individual's consciousness, level of development, understanding of life, it contributes naught. Nothing whatsoever. It does not change a person, in spite of the fact, again, as we all know, that someone does devote themselves to charitable works throughout a lifetime, they can, even if they're non-Catholic, can begin to be referred to as saintly. There they are. They have no life of their own. They have no family. They have no worldly possessions. And all they do is help other people. So even in the mainstream, again, there is a undeniable, commonly held view of such people as being saintly, that they have risen above the ordinary level, and they have not. They're no less, and that's not a criticism, but they simply have not. But now, taking all that, then look at the fact that even though it's now a known part, an acceptable part of common collective civilized behavior, it is looked upon with great favor. And I point out to you that it does nothing as far as the individual involved is concerned. And on top of all that, it's for me then to point out to you that originally it had another purpose. And the other purpose did not have to do with the people out there. It had to do with the guy trying to do it. The charity began at home. And the charity only began at his home once he left home. In what sense did he leave home? And I'm not saying that he now left his family and physically went out to help other people, which he may have done. But the leaving of home is to leave, perchance, one of the two places of residency to which he had given too much attention. And as an act of charity, based upon his suspicion, he turned his attention somewhere that apparently had absolutely no potential benefit. I shouldn't have left that on a high note. That had no potential benefit. Did anybody follow any of that? The first man, Harry, Adam's eldest grandson, after he got a couple of generations removed from Adam, Adam still suffering from that initial shock and not being run out of a garden. But within 2 generations, we had the first mystic. We had the first person asking the serious questions. So let us say that was Harry. Came up with the idea of helping his fellow man. That there was then enough people on the planet that he had enough materials to work with. He had enough people on the planet that if he spent his life helping those people, he wouldn't have time for anything else. I repeat, he already had to have understood the way life was arranged. He had to understand that life itself was alive. He had to understand that all ships have a captain topside and an engineer below, and the captain says that he is in charge and no one says otherwise, and yet the former is simply the latter's assistant. Harry had to know that. Harry had to know that no one needed help. Harry had to know that if, for some strange reason, life did momentarily trip and needed help, Harry knew that he wasn't the one that could help life. Harry was not an idiot. Harry was not suffering from that kind of rotten fruit-induced feeling of hubris, commonly referred to as religious. So Harry knew all of that, but he found that the more he studied on what he perceived to be the nature of life, the more that he studied the position that he perceived man to occupy in this structure, And after a long period of time came, you understand, mixing all these stories together, surprise, that he came to a grave suspicion that although the previous years had been of great benefit, or at least great enjoyment, he may have had the whole affair ass backwards. How to stay vigilant. Is the most fun always the last 5 minutes when I have to smoosh it all together? Or is it the least fun? When you take that which didn't make any sense easily to start with and then condense it. Okay. That makes you wonder if there was not some mystical origins to the Reader's Digest, but I don't want to get into that. If you cannot ride from the original castle, if you cannot undertake anything resembling the search for another state of consciousness, the trip itself, the adventure, even the proper study of it, if you cannot do it, which I assure you cannot, and you should know it yourself, in your ordinary state of mind, anybody who still believes that will believe anything. Be sure and contribute to my main charity. There's a box at the door when you go out. And be sure and leave by the second store window and flap your arms after you put money in, because you can fly. And in case you do fall down to the ground, it won't hurt you. You've got to understand by now that you can't do anything in your normal state of mind. And I know you can't understand it all the time. You can't remember it all the time. But when you do remember it, it is just as plain as tapioca, unflavored. It's just as plain as it can be that your normal state of mind has nothing to do with this. Nothing you have ever thought, especially about this, strike especially. Why overdo the obvious? The obvious is the obvious. Why brutalize the brutal? When you realize that your mind can add nothing, even thinking about this adds not one bit to it. It takes you no closer to it, thinking about it. So once you understand that, you understand that there's got to be, one I brought tonight that I know didn't go over too well, third surprise of the evening, right? That asks a question that says, are there three possible kinds of thinking? I mean, two possible kinds of thinking, even at the ordinary level. You remember that one? Even at the routine level, are there two kinds of thinking? Thinking and non-thinking thinking. The last part being evidenced by, which is very common amongst people, that one man will turn to another, and he's commenting on his ineffectual mental activity. You do it to each other all the time. All humans do. You turn around to somebody and just faux pot it, and you turn around and you go, you're not thinking. You know, they broke something. They were trying to fix a piece of machinery. They were trying to help you move something. They were trying to do something, and they lapsed. And you attribute it not to their clumsiness or because they got a club foot or something. You attribute it where apparently the blame actually belongs. You go, hey, and you punch somebody, and you go, you're not thinking. You know, the other person will go, in spite of the fact that the person going was obviously engaged in some kind of neural activity. So the question was, are there two kinds of thinking? Just thinking, like the guy who condemned the guy who made a mistake over here, that they're trying to do something together. Guy one. Let's say he's thinking. Because he's saying, all right, move it this way. Now pull it up a little bit. Now watch your step. Let's say he's thinking. That's just ordinary thinking. But in my example, this other guy does something that the second guy that strikes the first guy, who will attribute reasonable sanity to, he turns to that guy, and how he attributes to guy number two, or condemns him on the basis of, hey, you're not thinking. But the guy was some kind of neural activity was going on. We all know that. So the question was, are there two kinds of thinking? It's exemplified by the first guy, the condemner, thinking, and then non-thinking thinking. When he says, well, you're not thinking. You don't see any connection. You have got to stay in a state of alertness that is so unnatural that to say that's possible is almost overdoing it again. And yet you can do it. And apparently what's involved, that everybody goes along, no matter how it's presented, everybody interprets it their own way. If you'd read it, if you heard somebody say it, that the way to keep oneself alert is by the self-diagnosis, study of oneself, the observation of oneself, which I point out similar aspects, and that would seem to be it. That if attention is what's called for right now, if a person has got to, once they understand that I can affect truly my state of consciousness, I know it, it's not open to debate, nothing to talk about, I can do it, I can do it. But I can only do it when I remember to do it. And so then the problem is, how can I remember to do it? And there's got to be some sort of, apparently, some sort of key, some sort of trick to keep one vigilant. And it strikes everyone. That once they hear that noted, once they experience it, then the point is, well, I've got to keep this thing alert, and so you turn your attention to this. I'm not saying that's wrong, but there are two possible places of residency. There's in here and there's out there. And in here it just seems obviously the place to try and stimulate one's awareness. And yet why did Harry, the world's first mystic, at least in the West, why did he decide after some period of time, well, wait a minute, maybe no. And he decided, I'm going to turn all my attention outward. God, that makes no sense at all. I mean, not to anybody who's been listening to this for any length of time. And I know it, and I must apologize. I say that rhetorically because I'm not, but I know I must apologize. Tape off? Yes. Okay, well, just as long as I pull them out. I know that. I shouldn't keep saying I know that was fairly obscure tonight.